It's good to see everybody tonight. Open your Bibles to the book of Ezekiel. We are still working through this book and probably will be longer than the captivity itself, but we'll see what happens as it relates to the study as we work through it and trying to get as big a picture as we can, not getting too lost in the details, but diving into the details far enough at least to be able to appreciate and understand the message itself. And so we've been working through, we're in chapter 4, and we'll move right on into chapter 5. This is, in the material, if you have it, this is lesson 3 of the lesson sheets, lesson 3. And we're about a third, halfway down the page, working through chapter 4 together here. Because at the beginning of chapter 4, basically Ezekiel's told to build something. What is it? Okay, it's and what would we call that? A model, right? Build a model. So you take a brick and inscribe on that brick what Jerusalem would basically look like. You're going to build a fort around it, if you will, a besiegement around it. You're going to do various things so that when people would walk into where Ezekiel was residing, they would see this symbolic picture of what was happening back in Jerusalem, because Ezekiel was not what? Yeah, he's not in Jerusalem. He's in exile, right, back there along the river Chebar. He's back that direction, whereas there are others with him there in that location. So they needed to get a picture of what God's judgment was doing as it relates to Jerusalem in specific. So build this model so that people can kind of see that and have this picture representation of those things. And then he was going to have to do what? Okay, so lay on your left side for 390 days, 1 day for every year, and then flip over to your right side, do that for 40 days, on behalf of Judah. We talked last week about some ideas. I don't know that we could definitively, with 100% certainty, say this is exactly why those numbers. We got some pretty good ideas as to why, if you added those numbers up, it would represent the time they were in Egypt, or you could look at some of the kings, and from the time the fall, when Israel splits off, and that divided kingdom time period up until this moment. So there are things that you could look at that would kind of help you see why these numbers would be significant. But they certainly are a very vivid illustration of Ezekiel literally showing them how long God had been what? Patient in leading them and guiding, God for 430 years in various instances was helping and aiding and leading and encouraging. And God has been with them and blessed them, and they chose to take a different path that created the need for this judgment that's coming from God and this siege that beset them. And so he goes through that, and again, we talked about that last week. So that brings us up to about verse 9 of chapter 4. And he's told to do something here that seems a lot unusual in some ways. But what's he told to do? Okay, so he's going to have to make bread. So take thou also, and I briefly hinted at this last Wednesday, and I said, but we'll wait till we get further into the text before we addressed it. But when he says, take thou also unto thee, that kind of language implies that these things are happening in terms of chronology when? At the same time. I would agree with that. I believe that take thou also unto thee is in the same time period you're building this model. You're going to lay on your side for 390 days to represent those 390 years. You're going to do 40 more. This seems to be a concurrent event. Now again, I wouldn't stake 100% confidence in that, but that seems to be the language here, which would then imply that he's not laying on the floor 24/7, right? That as people would come, they would see him doing that, and they would also see him as it relates to this making of bread. Take thou also unto thee wheat and barley. Wheat would have generally been used on its own for wealthier people to make bread. Barley would have been used kind of as the primary source to make bread for poorer folk. But he's not going to take one or the other. He's going to take both and what? Beans and lentils and millet and fitches. And these are basically types of grains. It sounds, if you looked at it, you'd almost wonder, well, are we talking about deer meat here? Are we talking about, what are we, were these limas? You can kind of go through that process and wonder a little bit of what kind of thing is this. But these, I believe, are grains and maybe even like herbs, various things that would have been common to them. But it's not pure. That's the big picture you and I need to get here. It's not pure. In fact, eventually, what's he going to say about what God's instructions? Yeah, I've never done that before. Why do I start now? I've never eaten anything so common and unclean before. Why would I start that now? So that's the big picture I think we need to gain from this circumstance. So put them in one vessel, make thee bread thereof according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon thy side. So we're going to make this bread to have available to him through this process. 390 days shalt thou eat thereof, and thy meat, and by the way, meat there is just used as a term that translated more just food, not meat as in flesh, but his meat, his food, which thou shalt eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day, which, by the way, if I understand it right, is right at a half a pound. So right at a half a pound. If when I went and researched to try to understand about how much would 20 shekels by weight be, and from time to time shalt thou eat it. And that's not a lot. It might, but his whole day's ration. That's the big picture here. The truth be known, now some of us might, right? Anybody diet, right? And so if you're like me, well, 5 days a week, I know exactly how many calories are going in my body. 5 days a week, I know exactly how many calories are going in my body. 2 days a week, which is probably more common for most people, I don't have a clue, right? I'm not measuring it, I'm not counting it, I'm not thinking about it, I'm not caring about it. My point is, generally speaking, we don't think about it, right? We're very blessed that we don't have to ration. Now, some of you may have experienced, maybe in your youth or at other times in your life, where things weren't as plenteous and things weren't as good in terms of physical blessings, where maybe you did have to ration a little bit. And you'd have to be more careful about how much of anything that you used, and you didn't waste anything, and you would make sure all. And so that's the picture here. You make this your food is going to be made of this bread, of these odd, kind of unclean in a sense, and it's going to be even more unclean the way he's supposed to bake it. But you're going to have to measure it out, and you're not just going to be able to eat to the full. You're going to get about a half a pound, 20 shekels, by weight a day. And so from time to time, you'll pinch off a little bit of this bread. And thou shalt drink also water by measure, the sixth part of an hin. Again, as I understand it, oddly enough, that's about 8 ounces. Yeah. So it's roughly, in one text I said it was about 6/10 of a pint. I heard other texts say as much as 9/10 of a pint. So, but you're still not, you're somewhere in that 8 to 12, 13 ounce range. I'm not real good at converting measurements in my head. That's why I have Alexa. That's a device, by the way, not a lady that walks around my house answering questions. But anyway, and she tells me. So if I want to know how many tablespoons in a cup or something like that, I just say, hey, Echo, how many tablespoons in a cup? And she'll tell me. And that's how I do. If I want to know what 20 times 390 is, I ask Alexa and she tells me. That's just my world. Deal with it. I know the Bible. That's all I know. And so we not very well at that either when it comes to Ezekiel. So my point, friends, is simply this, not to ramble, which is what I did, is that measurement is not much. Not a lot to eat, not a lot to drink. In a day's worth, you're going to have to ration it, Ezekiel. And when people would come in, they're going to see that he's confined, he's bound, restricted in that sense. He's laying on his side. He's eating an odd portion of things, not that much. And you'll eat it as barley cakes. And thou shalt, and here's the hard part, thou shalt bake it with dung that cometh out of man in their sight. Now, as best I can understand, when they say bake it with dung, they're not talking about another ingredient. Talking about the flame by which, the way you're going to bake it, the heat, which was, by the way, more common than you think in those days. Now, not necessarily human, but animal waste would be used when you had nothing else to burn. There would be a practice by which there would be some who would have to resort to have any heat source whatsoever to using animal waste in order to do that. And in some of the rarest and most desperate of circumstances. And so the illustration picture, again, Jerusalem besieged. Here's the model. What's going on in Jerusalem? Oh, Ezekiel's representing that, where they know there's not a lot to eat, there's not a lot to drink, and it's getting so bad that they're using their own waste as the fuel source by which to cook what they do have. And what's his reaction? And don't, his reaction is what our reaction would have been, right? I would gander a thought here. So he says, and the Lord said, even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, the point we made a minute ago, whither I will drive them. Then said I, Ezekiel says, Lord God, behold. By the way, help me out here. I'm trying to think in my own mind here. We had communication coming from God. I'm trying to think, have we had any moment yet where Ezekiel gives a response to anything? I don't think we have. I think this is the first time. Again, you can go back and read the first 3 chapters again and see, but this seems to be the first moment where Ezekiel goes, I got a question here. I got a question. I've never done anything that's polluted my soul. By the way, it's a legitimate reason why God chose Ezekiel. He's one of the remnant of people that didn't abandon. He's caught up, by the way, and that's a sad reality, but it's true. He's caught up in the same consequences like everybody else, though he seems to be somebody who is part of a remnant like who else? Like Daniel, like Jeremiah, right? There's a handful of folks that were a remnant of remaining faithful and dedicated unto Jehovah in the midst of all this, but they're caught up in the same challenges like everybody else because the judgment is against the people as a whole. And so he says, from my youth up, even till now. That's an interesting statement, right? Because you've been dragged out of your homeland, been given residence in a foreign land, you got no real way to sustain yourself there. You're having to kind of eke out an existence. And the temptation might have been to what? Abandon, God's punishing us anyway. So is there any reason for me to maintain my integrity of convictions as it relates to God in the midst of all this? But men like Ezekiel and Daniel did what they could to maintain their integrity throughout this. Even when the king says, here, eat these things, Daniel asked to be excused, and those with him in relationship to that. Go ahead, Bob. No, you mean when he's over, they're done?
Verse 7 talks about the siege of Jerusalem, which I think is 40 days, right? And then it says he would be tied with ropes and he'll continue until he has finished the days of your siege. Is that the same period?
No, I don't think that they're talking about that the besiegement of Jerusalem would only last the exact same amount of days that Ezekiel's at, if I'm understanding your question.
Well, I guess it's kind of hard for me to explain all that. I don't understand what I'm talking about too much.
Well, that'll be good that I can't answer it then, but that'll be...
The siege of Jerusalem, is that not when he's supposed to prophesy to the people about what they have done?
Well, keep in mind, his audience is the people in exile. So he's letting the folks in exile know what's happening back in Jerusalem. And so his depiction here is to let the folks that are with him in exile know what's happening back in the homeland.
Well, that's what I'm asking now in verse 8.
Yeah.
When it says, your siege will be finished, is that the same siege, same amount of time, same period there? Or is that something different?
Yeah, I don't know that, no, I don't think they necessarily correspond in time, if that's what you're asking me. I think his is symbolic of what's happening in Jerusalem, not necessarily trying to say, as soon as you're done, Ezekiel, they'll be done. I don't know that that's the case, but maybe there'll be something within the text that'll help us understand.
Blinding and bad stuff, laying on your side for so long, is this symbolic too, or is this not physical?
Oh, I think he's doing it, but he's doing it not just to show some kind of depravity on his side. He's doing it to be a figure, a living illustration of the judgment that God has brought to his people. So I think he's literally doing these things. But he's doing them in a figure or as a figure so that they can have some glimpse of what's going on back home. Right, yeah. It's on scale of what they're experiencing. So he becomes so, and again, remember, and there's a couple of times where he says it, so that when people come in and see you, so when those who are in exile with him come in and see him, they'll get a picture of what's going to be happening when the judgment of God comes. I realize those timing events sometimes are difficult, and that's why I take a bigger or wider view of those things and don't necessarily get caught up. I don't think he's necessarily trying to give us a specific time period in which these events are going to start and end, so much as a representation of what's happening in the judgment of God.
Hey, Brian,
Yes, go ahead.
I got a question in that. Where it's like a fuel instead of made right into the bread.
Uh-huh.
Because those all say that I haven't ate, but I need to defile bread, I haven't ate anything of dead or whatever it is, that's all eating. And I thought with the siege, I thought it was like 3 years of siege for Jerusalem, and they would be eating everything in there. That's why I thought
Yeah.
it was depicted as truly, a little bit of it in there, not half of it or something.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I never thought of no flame.
Yeah, everything I can gather, you're not. I don't know if there's a moment where we see that ever being depicted as an ingredient, and for lack of a better word, something they're consuming.
In 15, it says, "And you shall prepare your bread over it." When he says, "I'll give you cow instead," at least that's how my.
Yeah, so some translations use a word to imply that you're baking something over top of the other, and
New King James says as fuel.
New King James actually uses the phrase "as fuel," and so I think there's plenty of language and historical documentation that would illustrate that that's what's happening here. Yeah, right.
I was just going to say, when you use certain fuels, it incorporates the flavor in that.
Trust me, I love to cook with charcoal, right? And why? Because what you're burning gets absorbed, and so it would defile it. Maybe not quite as bad, but it would defile it nonetheless.
It seems like this is just, things will be so bad
Yeah.
that they're going to have to resort, because normally their refuse was to be buried
Right.
and not used for something like this.
And ultimately, he begs, don't make me do this. And he doesn't get necessarily a perfect answer, but at least he gets a slightly better. Okay, I'll provide for you the waste from a cow, and you can exchange to prepare your bread with. Verse 16, "Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, behold, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they shall eat bread by weight and with care, and they shall drink water by measure and with astonishment." So, again, he's doing what's going to be happening in the besiegement, and so what he's doing is a representation of that. But it's interesting, what that word there at the end, they will do this in what way? In astonishment. Why in astonishment?
They never had to do that before. They had plenty.
I think that's the implication here. That at least this generation had not experienced the levels of poverty and difficulty that they're about to encounter. And they're going to be going, how did this happen, when the truth of how it happened is before them, and the prophets have been telling them. And they've got Jeremiah back there telling them, as well.
They'll end up resorting, eating one another.
Yeah, and you read those parallel texts as well, you see some of that language, how bad it really gets in that moment. And then verse 17, the end of chapter 4, and then we'll look at those couple of questions that relate to that. But he says that they may want bread and water and be astonished one with another and consume away for their iniquity. So their choices and decisions has brought them to this. God isn't simply trying to create punishment and difficulty for them. Their decisions and choices has led them to this extreme circumstance, and Ezekiel has to depict it in order so those outside of that experience will also understand the fullness of that judgment that God had brought. So the two questions were then, of what did Jehovah have Ezekiel make bread, and how was it prepared? And we spent the last 15 minutes cringing while we talked about that.
Baked over done.
Okay, so make it out of all kinds of things, and then use waste in order to have the fuel to be able to bake that bread. Consume it by measure, right? Consume it by measure from time to time. Weigh out 20 shekels worth per day, and from time to time throughout the day, consume that. And then what did this signify to the captives in Babylon? What's going on back there? What's going to be going on and the difficulties that are going to be experiencing back in Jerusalem. Chapter 5 ties, but I'll pause. Thoughts or questions about chapter 4?
Just that in verse 13, it says that, so shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, where I will drive them. So
Yeah.
the way they were going to have to prepare it was going to defile it.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes. Ezekiel is going to have to experience what all of them are going to have to experience, because this would have been more common among the Gentile world. And the kinds of things and the ways they're doing things here was more common among the Gentile world, and that's where they're being driven to. And they're going to be experiencing the very kinds of things that you would see in those places.
Those left in Jerusalem, weren't they just, they took all the good people, the smart, the intelligent, the healthy, and left the rest?
Well, they in two waves, right? They come and take them at a couple of different times. And generally, yeah, they would take who they believed to be. I mean, you might miss one or two, you know what I mean? But who they believe, and not necessarily always the smartest, but you would take the royalty. Yeah. You would take leadership. You wouldn't want to leave as best you could, because the idea was the idea from Nebuchadnezzar. If you want to talk about it from a non-spiritual standpoint, in other words, he's fulfilling the purposes of God. That's ultimately needs to be understood primary. But from a pure national standpoint, he does, what he wants to do is he wants to go down there and remove any kind of leadership that he can. He wants to take them out and go relocate them somewhere else. And that way, when he establishes his own leadership inside that location, then he can begin to slowly turn that place into just an extension of Babylon, right? That tactic, by the way, militarily, and it's not stopped. That concept of going in and trying to destroy the leadership in some particular place, it's happening right now as we speak. If you can destroy the leadership in a particular location and then implement or place your leaders in the place of those, now I've got control. And that was going on in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, and it's still to this day a tactic that rulers and leaders throughout the world have used and continue to use. And so you can see it from that perspective a little bit as well. Chapter 5. So, when he's finished with these things, thou son of man, take thee a sharp knife, and take thee a barber's razor. By the way, I think it's the only time the word barber you ever see, King James. Is there any other translations have a different word there? It's interesting, isn't it? It's kind of a one only moment where you see that. But take thee a barber's razor and cause it to pass upon thine head and upon thine beard, and then take thee balances to weigh and divide the hair. Now, here's what's interesting to me about that. So, shave your beard off, shave your hair off, and then what? Weigh it. Now, if I told you to shave your hair off, shave your beard off, and divide it in thirds, you'd probably go, right? You'd go, that looks close enough to a third, a third, a third. Ezekiel, weigh it. Don't just push a little over there and push a little over there and leave a little here and go, it looks like that's a third, that's a third, that's a third. Weigh it. Be precise. It's just an interesting kind of aspect to me that God still is the same God He's always been. Under that Old Testament law, precision in terms of exactly what they were to do, when they were to do it, how they were to do it, what they were supposed to use when they did it. Detail, detail, detail. And even though God's punishing the people, even though Ezekiel becomes this living example of what God's doing to His people, God hasn't abandoned who He is. And He's still requiring of Ezekiel some very, very specific things, from the ingredients to what He's going to bake His bread out of, how much He's going to weigh out per day, how much water He's going to have per day. There's a lot of detail in what He's challenging Ezekiel to do. So you're going to divide the hair. Thou shalt burn with fire a third part in the midst of the city, when the days of the siege are fulfilled. And thou shalt take a third part and smite about it with a knife, and a third part thou shalt scatter in the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. So, really a simplistic picture here, right? Simpler than maybe we make it out to be. A third of the people are going to get just consumed, right? Burned, just consumed. Fire, that's the imagery. So a third are just going to get consumed. Then another third, he says, when fire a third part in the midst of, when the days of siege are fulfilled, thou shalt take a third part and smite it about with a knife. So third will get consumed, the other will die by knife or sword, right? And there will be some who are going to wander what? Like the wind. They're going to get scattered, but while they're being scattered, they're going to get chased down by those with swords as well. A third just consumed. A third die by knife, and a third will try to scatter, but will be chased by those with drawn swords when they attempt to do that. Thou shalt also take thereof a few in number, and bind them in thy skirts, or in the hem of thy garment, and then take again of them, and cast them in the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire, for thereof shall a fire come forth into all the house of Israel. Yeah.
They always use the shaving of the head as a form of mourning.
Yeah. Yeah, he would have been forbidden to eat the food he ate fixed too. He's doing a lot of things he would not have necessarily been allowed to do. And I think, again, the imagery is that the defilement of the people, the iniquity and lawlessness of the people has driven them to this judgment, to where God's saying, okay, you as a people have chosen iniquity and defilement. You're going to live that way. You're going to live in that fashion. So as a prophet, which he's kind of converted to here, this imagery of this head shaved and how God's, and even, just even if a few hairs escape, it may be only temporary. Even those who might find some escape are still going to find themselves in the consequence and difficulty. So what did he do? That's the question on the page. What did he do after those days? He shaves his head, his beard, collects that into thirds. And you jump down to verse 12, because you kind of get the definition. A third part of thee shall die with the pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of thee. A third part shall fall by the sword round about thee, and I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. So there's very specific kind of description of what he's representing with these hairs that he does various things with. And it helps us get just very clear image that some pestilence and famine, all the things that happen when your city is under siege, and all the difficulties that come because of that, some will just die based on that. Some are going to fall by a sword. Others might find a way to escape temporarily, but they're going to get chased down and die by the sword as well. this judgment God is bringing is severe and difficult. Run back to verse 3. Thou shalt also take thereof a few, as we stated, and bind them in thy skirts. Then take of them again, cast them in the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire, for thereof shall a fire come forth into the house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set it in the midst of the nations and countries that are round about her, and she hath changed my judgments into wickedness more than the nations, and my statutes more than the countries that are round about her, for they have refused my judgments and my statutes. They have not walked in them. We answered that question about what these hairs represent, but I do want to ask this question that the lesson sheet asked. Why then did Jehovah bring these terrible judgments upon them that we just read? Yeah, God blessed them among all the nations, and they still refused His statutes. They still refused to follow His judgments. They still rejected Him. Even though He helped and blessed and raised them into a better state and status than any of the other nations round about. You multiplied more than the nations that are round about you, verse 7. And yet have not walked in my statutes, neither have kept my judgments, neither have done according to the judgments of the nations that are round about you. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I, even I, am against thee, and will execute judgments in the midst of thee, in the sight of the nations. I will do in thee that which I have not done, and whereunto I will not do any more the like, because of all thine abominations. In other words, it's getting so bad that the kind of consequence I'm bringing to you I've never done before and don't plan to do again. Their condition is deplorable, even though He had blessed and aided and let them multiply and grow above all the nations around them.
And they probably expected that He would do that again.
Yeah, I think they had full expectations that this is just God's always going to, and the challenges are going to come. Go ahead, Bob.
In this division of third, in Jeremiah, God warned the people not to go back to Egypt. Is this what this third is kind of escaping, what that is?
I think so. I think the imagery here is just some are going to die just because of the awful circumstances that are going to happen in the land. Some are going to die by sword directly, and some maybe feel a moment of escape. Let's go, whether it be Egypt or wherever. We're going to be able to flee this. We're going to get away from God's judgment. He says, no, you're not. Even those who are going to try to escape. Yeah. And so that consequence is coming, and the judgment of God is coming any way that you might look at that. And all because of the choices that they had made. Let's quickly look at the very end. Thus shall mine anger be accomplished, verse 13. And I will cause my fury to rest upon them. I will be comforted. So it's going to come hard, but is it forever? No. Eventually, I'll be content that I've accomplished enough consequence. That's the imagery here. They shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it in my zeal when I have accomplished my fury in them. And so there's an end here. This isn't permanent. This isn't something that would be done because we know that they're allowed to eventually go back home. They rebuild the temple. They have all those home again heroes, we often call them. Those folks like Zerubbabel and folks will come back. But I'm going to fulfill it first. And when I'm done, I'll find peace that I've finished all these things sufficiently enough. And they will eventually end. The nations round about them will see that in the sight of all that pass by. So it shall be a reproach and a taunt. They're going to imagine these what was once the great nation among nations will become a mockery when the judgment of God comes and what they see in them. when He executes His judgments. Again then, verse 16, when I shall send upon them the evil arrows of famine, which shall be for their destruction, and which I will send to destroy you, and I will increase the famine upon you, and will break your staff of bread, so will I send upon you famine and evil beasts, and they shall bereave thee, and pestilence and blood shall pass through thee, and I will bring the sword upon thee. I, the Lord, have spoken it. The key to this simply is this: it is done. I have spoken it. And the consequences have to come before he can be comforted and feel like he's accomplished the task that needed to be accomplished in terms of his judgment against them and the fulfillment of those things. All right, so Lord willing, next Wednesday, jump into chapter 6, jump into lesson 4. We'll continue to examine these things that Ezekiel shares with us.